coming, and I want to thank Dick Ellis, who invited me in the first place, who couldn't be here tonight. But Mark Ansicek, is that how you say it?
Yes.
Ansicek has taken over, so I appreciate that. And I certainly appreciate you all coming here. Mark pretty much stole my whole spiel, so I don't have too much to say, but I'm gonna start over and reiterate some of what he said and go into it in a little more detail. Normally what I do is I speak about Cuba at universities, and it's a socio-political talk. With some photography, but more talking about Cuba. Because this is a photo group, we're going to do more of like a tour of Cuba. Put together a large 2-hour tour presentation, and I've cut that way back to give you something tonight, but I don't want to spend the whole night on Cuba because that's not the only thing I do, and I realize that's not the only thing you're interested in. You all have, I didn't know what to expect. I thought there was going to be 19-year-old college students. And obviously this is a different group. But some of you are older than that. Pardon me? Well, I'm in that same group. So,
Do you include the socio-political?
well, that's always part of Cuba. You can't talk about Cuba without it. And I don't know, have any of you ever been to Cuba in this crowd? One? In the last 10, 15 years?
40 years ago.
4 years ago?
40.
Oh, 40 years ago. Well, that counts, sort of. But it's not the Cuba of today.
No.
So I did buy my first camera in Vietnam, and that was my interest in photography, and that I did have access to a darkroom in Georgia when I came back to the States. And that sort of got me going, and there was some magic to it. And I'm sure all of you have worked in dark rooms, or assuming you've all worked in dark rooms, because when you were younger, that's all there were. There weren't digital cameras. And the book actually represents the end of my darkroom work. The book was entirely done on film, 35 millimeter, 120, all black and white. Every picture is full frame, no props. That's sort of my signature, because when I print with the edges where you scrape, if you know how to scrape the edges of the film holders and you get the dark edges. So that's always been my style. So when I did the book, I decided to leave everything full frame and just let it stand for itself. Because I grew up in the analog era, I don't do a lot of digital fancy work. So when I work with digital now, I try to do the same things I did in the darkroom: dodge and burn, spot, touch up, but things I could have done in the darkroom. So I try to stay to that mantra pretty much, rather than get into, people do brilliant things digitally, and I admire it, but it's not what I do. So when I like documentary work, the nudes I've been doing for 45 years. It was one of my early interests. I just studied. I never took any courses, which I don't recommend. You should all take courses. But I didn't do that. And I just studied nudes in magazines, and a lot of stuff out of Europe was very good. Photo out of Europe in the 60s and 70s was very good. So I learned just by looking at pictures and looking at art. And I worked for years with a Hasselblad camera in a studio, black and white torsos primarily. So I did that for years and years, and that was my fine art outlet. I decided at some point I did not want to make my living with my camera. I wanted to do personal work, do what I wanted to do, and in 1983 I opened a photo lab, Quicksilver Photo in Plymouth, Michigan, and ran that for 25 years until I went broke. And then
Those people out there don't appreciate the quality of that work.
And then I decided that I need to find a way to make a living, and I've always had a camera in my hand, so I start working at age 65, 64, I start working as a commercial photographer. So I started a bit late, but I find that I make twice as much and work half as much as I did when I ran a business and had a bunch of employees and a bunch of overhead. I have a house in Ann Arbor. I have a 2-story carriage house in the back, and the upstairs is a somewhat primitive but very effective studio, so I have a studio there. I print on an Epson 4900 printer, which is in my living room, not working, and I get a fair amount of commercial work, and that keeps me going. There are 4 aspects to what I do. Everything I do is photographically. So the fine art nudes has been going on for 45 years. The Cuba came about in 1996. I had some friends whose son was in Havana doing a documentary film about a very famous Cuban filmmaker, and they were going to go visit him. And just as a lark, I said, I think I'll go with you. And I'd just gone through some troubling personal times and some life. I went through life for a while there. And so when I went to Cuba, it just opened my eyes. I was so locked into running my business every day, and I had a 10-year-old daughter, was married, and everything was just based around that. I was trapping myself. I used to travel more, and I was traveling less. And my first trip to Cuba just opened up my eyes, and I really credit Cuba and the Cuban people for getting me to where I'm at today, especially with the work in Cuba. So starting then, I started going every couple of months, and I met a very famous Cuban photographer, Roberto Salas, who was one of the, they call him the epic Cuban photographers, and he was one of the people who came in 1959 with Fidel Castro to Cuba to document everything that the regime did. And there were a group of those photographers, and I got to meet all but one of them. One of them had already passed away. But in that first short period of time, I was introduced to all these amazing photographers, and I collect their work. I was going to bring some of that tonight, but I wasn't sure how much space we'd have, and I didn't want to lug it. I could have brought 100 pieces, so I tried not to do that. So I started buying and selling art and photography from Cuba, primarily photography, and I started documenting Cuba. And I was going to solely end the embargo, and it's, you know, I'm opposed to the embargo for numerous reasons, which we may or may not get into. But I thought I would single-handedly end that, and that hasn't quite worked out. Still going on all these many years later, and I've been there now 50 times or so. I continue to go a couple times a year. Pardon me?
How do you get permission to go?
Well, I went illegally most of the time, and then because of my publishing and my lecturing, I became quasi-legal enough that I could say I was in Cuba, and they would go, okay, just get out of here. So they've never, twice I was threatened to be fined, but they never fined me, and now I just go, somewhere in there I married a Cuban woman. We'll get to that later. And that also makes me legal, although we've separated, but we had a 15-year relationship. No complaints. So I'm legal, and I still go through Canada, fly down, get my passport stamped. They don't stamp U.S. passports of mine. I'm on my third passport, and they're filled with stamps. And so that's part of the protest end of what I do. And then my lectures and talks, I'm just trying to explain, because all the policies are U.S. policies and not Cuban policies, I feel I have a right to talk about them. I don't have a right to decide for Cubans, but I do have a right to decide for Americans. So as a result, most of my lectures evolve around that socio-political aspect of life in Cuba as relates to the United States and U.S. policies. So tonight, you get the hybrid. So I'm doing a little bit of this where I'm just talking about stuff. And then I'm going to do this slideshow, which I'm going to sort of run through. I don't know what pace. I'm not sure what's on it, because I sort of did a quick clip from an old show. But what it's intended to be is a tour around the country. And it may not be fine photography, but it sort of gives you an idea of what life is like in Cuba. It is all in color, and I did that because when I started my website, it was a free use website for students and educators, and most of them wanted color. So I shot slides through the 90s and into the 2000s until I switched to digital, which was not till 2005. So a lot of the stuff you'll see is from slides. And it's just a look at everyday life. I call myself the lowest common denominator. When I go someplace, I like to walk on the streets. I don't look for I don't go to the Cuban government and say, what do you want me to show? And I don't show what the United States wants you to show, which is people suffering, which is not the case generally anyway. So I just go out and walk around by myself and talk to people and get into houses and hospitals and churches, and it's remarkable the access I've had. I photographed open heart surgery this far from a chest cavity just by knowing a doctor and walking into a hospital one day and say, can I take some pictures? The next day I know I'm 2 feet from a heart in somebody's hand taking pictures. So I've had tremendous access to almost everything in Cuba, in education, healthcare, everything that they offer. And I've seen the best and the worst of it. So I just go on with it. And so this slideshow we're going to see, I'm assuming you want to see a slideshow.
Absolutely.
Is that right? Or you just want to talk? I can do this for 2 hours. So I will do this, and I will sort of do a running commentary. You are welcome. I love questions. So anytime if you see something and you go, oh, not that. Don't say that, but say, you know, I have a question, and I'll answer it if I can. Most of them I can. I know all these photos because I took them. So I think we'll do that, and then we'll go back and I'll talk a little bit about some of this other stuff that I brought. On the easels, the non-frame pictures, there's about 6 pictures on each easel. So when you get up, they're front and back on those. Those are just how I store pictures, and I just grabbed a handful to bring over. So they're all cute. The only 2 nudes are. This is from a series I did 2 shows this past year. One was called one was a Cuba show, which was about 40 pieces. And then I did a nude show, a very big nude show with about 60 pieces. And then I was a guest artist in another show, and this is from that show, and this is from a series called Identity. And the other one is from the Mexicali, Mark mentioned Mexicali early on, the girl with the tacks on her. And that was taken from an idea from Frida Kahlo, where she had put thorns in her body, although she put them point in. And I put the tacks point out, so no one got stabbed in the making of that picture.
Okay.
No one was harmed in the making of that picture.
It was really
But it was an homage to some of Frida Kahlo's work and part of a broader base Mexicali series. And I actually brought a printout of the information on that show, which if anyone wants to look through it, it was I think 70 pieces in that show. It was a really big show. And then the other one was just a small 8-piece show, was the Identity show. And then this year I have a show coming up. I have 2 Cuba shows coming up this year, so I continue to show my work. I also, my first year in Cuba, I met Roberto Salas, as I told you, who wrote the introduction to my book. And he was doing nudes at the time and heard that I was doing nudes through my friends that were down there. And I brought a couple down and he said, do you want to be in a show and send some of your nudes? So I sent, I think, three prints down. And I used to print square, my Hasselblad black and white square. So I sent 3 pictures and they really liked them. And it was 100 photographers from all over the world. And then I got a call and they said, do you want to do a one-man show in the National Gallery of Cuban Photography of your nudes? So in 1997 I had a one-man show, so I was famous in Cuba, much more than I ever will be or was here. So that was very interesting. That was part of my introduction to Cuba. So now I'm going to take you guys there. Do we need to douse the lights or turn them down a bit or something? Hopefully this will go.
Good.
I'm just going to push this button and sort of watch it on over here, and which one is it? And say a few things.
There's a front switch.
Pardon?
Front switch.
Switch by the door.
No,
Oh,
by
over
the
here?
door.
Oh, that's nice. Oh, you all look better too. First of all, this is Cuba. It's 90 miles from Havana. I was pointer here. I never used it. Havana is right here, and 90 miles north is Key West, Florida. It's our closest non-connected neighbor, and the one we're most disconnected from. It's an island. It's 800 miles long. Has 3 major mountain ranges, lots of other mountain ranges. There's 11 million people. A little over 2 million are in the city of Havana. All the capitals tend to be in the center of the provinces rather than on the ocean. So when you're there, it's not so much an island as a country. So you really feel like you're somewhere and you're not just at the beach. In fact, I rarely go to the beach. I'm a city guy, so I'm in the city somewhere. And you'll see some of that. So what I've done is, we're taking a trip from west, and we're going to sort of circle around here. We're going to circle around this way and down here to Santiago de Cuba and out to Baracoa, and then wander back up here and end up in Havana. So it's sort of a tour around the island, and I'll let you know where we're at. There's a couple maps that will pop up to sort of keep you up to date, but that's the idea of the system, wander around. Commentary will come when I get the urge, and we'll see what happens. We start out in the west, which is considered the genteel end of the island. It's where the tobacco is grown. And tobacco is handled very, very carefully by hand, and stretched and dried, and it's very delicate. And then the eastern part of the island is sugarcane, where it's machetes and rough workers. So there's this contrast from one end of the island to the other, the genteel and then the really rugged part of the. So there's a huge change as you go across the island. You see a lot of different things. So we'll start with that. This is in Pinar area in the western province. This is the capital of that province. I was there after a rainstorm, and I sort of call it the city of pillars because it seemed like every block the houses had pillars. And in 50 years, there's been almost no construction in Cuba. Reparations, yes. Construction, no. So everything you see is pretty old, which is very interesting. The good part is that nothing has ever been torn down. The bad part is a lot of it's falling down. Hard to say. So it's a beauty shop. This is still in Pinar. This was a wedding. You see a 55 Chevy there, so you see the old cars all the time. As much as I say I'll never take another picture of those old cars, I do it all the time. Pretty irresistible. School kids early morning in the classroom. Some people on the street. This is tobacco. Tobacco is a very short season, about 3 months long. So there's a tobacco leaves, and I haven't often been out there in the tobacco season. This is a woman, I was just walking down the street and she was sitting in her window and I asked if I could come in and take her picture for this beautiful old home. This is the interior of her house, sort of a classic Cuban structure. This is in Vinales Valley. These are called Mogotes, these mountains, and this is very, very rich tobacco territory. These are the Mogotes. It's a very unusual rock formation. Pardon me?
It's significant, what's it mean?
Mogote is a term for a rock formation, and I think there's only two places in the world. They describe them as fists punched up through them, because they all sort of pop up like that. So in that valley, this is a man named Robina who has since passed away, but he was one of the most famous tobacco growers in Cuba. This is his patio about 3 or 4 years ago. And this is, again, the tobacco growing part of the country. So now we're moving back down the south coast, Cienfuegos, Trinidad, San Espiritu, all these cities are here. So this is actually on the water, or this is a bay at Cienfuegos. And I went there with some professors from University of Michigan on a project. I think I have some pictures of that in here, I hope. And there's Che Guevara. Everyone knows that picture, the Che picture, I hope. The last picture in my book is a picture of my daughter with the photographer holding up that picture which he gave to her. So make sure you look at that. That's the only personal picture in my book. All the rest of it is, this is the harbor again at Cienfuegos. And this is the map of the property, the Atkins property, and the Atkins people were people from Harvard who owned this huge plantation, and it's the biggest collection of palm trees in the world, 200 and some variations of palm trees. And that's one of the things we went down to photograph at the University of Michigan. This is called Pepito Té, and this is a sugar refinery. This is where all the sugar cane comes in. This is the entrance to Pepito Té, and these factories, I guess you call them, are so big that they have schoolhouses and people live there, and it's a city basically, and it works around the building itself. And these are the machines. As you can see, they're not updated. Let me change glasses here, so I can see too.
Who owns this facility?
The Cuban government owns everything. That's easy. That's an easy question. Although across the street is where this arboretum is with all the palm trees, and there's a fight in the Atkins family there there's a Senator Chet Atkins, I think is his name, not the guitar player, who is trying to keep the ties with Cuba, and there's the other half of the family which is very right-wing and doesn't want anything to do with Cuba, and even this marvelous plantation until things change there, which I don't know what that means. So anyway, this is actually, one kid was sitting in this window at the school and it was up about this high, and I went to take his picture and I actually had to turn away because I thought they were going to fall out. It's pretty funny to listen to these kids. And these are the narrow gauge trains that run the sugar cane. So you can see there are 3 of them coming out of the barn there. And they're the old, this is across the street on the plantation where they do all the research. This is one of the women that we were studying down there, Ramona Quesada. This is her house. Pretty interesting entryway. And this is Ramona, the very demonstrative Ramona, talking to one of the professors from UM. And this is typical of the peasant housing out in the rural areas. That's a bedroom. Another campesino in the area. Some of these are just pictures of people. So now we get, as we said, we're moving east, and it's getting rougher, and now you see the cane cutters and the machismo of the eastern part. It's more mountainous, much coarser.
Are the people pretty open to you taking pictures?
Very open.
Yeah, because you see a lot of.
Yeah, very open.
Go ahead.
Yeah, surprising open. Actually, less so now than when I first started, just because there's a lot more tourists poking cameras in people's faces. So when I first went, especially away from Havana, I had access to just about anything. And even in Havana, it was pretty good. Now this is Trinidad, which is probably the most single historic city, in that it's all historic. So it's filled with museums and cobblestone streets, and it's mostly a tourist attraction, but pretty interesting for a day. I wouldn't want to spend a lot of time there. These are museums and town squares. And this was actually built ostensibly to keep an eye on the plantation, but it was really to watch for runaway slaves back in the 1800s. Around 1850, there were more slaves than there were Spanish in Cuba because they brought them over to harvest the sugar cane. What they did different from the United States was they kept the families together and they kept their religion. So slaves were not sold individually, they were sold in families, and then when slavery was abolished, they just acclimated in state, which is why you get such diversity there. And that was the climate was similar to where their heritage was from. They were mostly from West Africa, Nigeria, Yoruban, so it's Yoruban culture. So, and this is actually school kids, and one day a week they go out and work for 2 hours, just hoeing up and hoeing the fields or whatever they have to do. They work in the fields for one afternoon a week. Now we're moving up around. This is Las Tunas, where my wife's family is from, and Rodin. So we'll wander up there. This is in Las Tunas. Again, the cars skip me every time. This is a barber shop, which I think is pretty unique. Good place. This house in the background. And for some reason, Bugs Bunny's popular. So there he is. But this is it. These guys are selling limes in the marketplace, but I just like the graphic behind them. I thought it was pretty interesting. Is this clear and everything to you guys? I can't see what you're seeing. I'm assuming
Yeah,
it is.
it's good.
This is in Las Tunas, where my wife's family is from, and this is a baseball game that I went to, and I went with my brother-in-law and some other people, and I said, how much to get in? He goes, 5 pesos, which is 20 cents. And they said, but we don't really have to pay, so you just won't go in. So it was a great afternoon. We just hung out at the ballpark. And as you can see, it's almost all men. I think there are 4 women in that entire picture. But afternoons in baseball season, that's where they end up. Gas is extremely expensive, so they use what they have to use to get things done. This is a worker that works a small piece of property right around the corner from where my wife's family is. And these are bohíos, the thatched roofed houses. So this would be out in these are considered campesinos or country folk. These are outside the cities and pretty common. They usually have small plots of land that they own and farm. These are all the heroes of the Cuban Revolution all over the years. This is another sugar refinery, a smaller one than the other one we saw. On the right is Fidel and his brother and Camilo Cienfuegos and Che Guevara and Jose Marti and a couple others who I don't recall. I thought it was pretty interesting to show them. This is a very small town called Zulueta that I was just sort of wandering around in. Most of the houses were just these low row houses, and then I ran across this one, which is sort of classic building, so I took a picture of that. Now we're getting to the far end of the island. Santiago de Cuba is the 2nd largest city, very interesting, very hilly, very tight, narrow streets. To the far east is Baracoa, which I don't know, I think I have some pictures of Baracoa, but Baracoa was inaccessible for years except by boat or by plane until they finally built a road, I think 15 or 20 years ago. So it has a sort of different character and has a lot of culture coming from Haiti because that's the closest connection to Haiti. So there's some voodoo there, whereas the rest of the island is Santeria, and they're very similar, but voodoo is pretty much based in that far eastern part of the country. Well, this is the city of Santiago, so you get an idea of what the streets are like. This is another one where I was just walking by and the house was very dark, and I set my camera on the windowsill, and this woman came up and I said, can I take a picture? And I didn't expect to get anything. And sort of got a beautiful picture of the interior of her house. And then she asked me to come in, and her husband was sleeping in this room, and she said, oh no, you have to see this. And she just wanted to show me this icon that she had put together. So inside there you will see on the bottom right is San Lazaro, which is Santeria, and then the crucifix, of course. So what happens is they blended Catholicism and Santeria in almost all the houses. There's a little bit of both, or a lot of one, or a lot of the other, or none at all, but they're very much intertwined. And this is the birthplace of Antonio Maceo, who won't mean much to you, but he was one of the heroes of the Cuban Revolution. Just before the United States came in and claimed victory, basically the Cubans fought the war against the Spaniards, and then when it was almost won, the U.S. came in and said, we defeated the Spanish, and then they wrote the Plan Amendment to sort of take control of Cuba for the next, until Fidel came in and got rid of that. So So Maceo was very famous. Fought for like 40 years in all different wars, he and his brothers. There's a big smiling happy Cuba. This again is Santiago, to get an idea. This would have been one of the big commercial streets, and it still is. Pretty interesting. Some of the murals are real popular and they're always nice to see. Breastfeeding, I like these because they're very pragmatic. It's time to feed them, they feed them. So it's not such a, I hear we're a little more Protestant about it, I guess. Down there, people are pretty open. And this, I was walking around in some side streets and I heard some music coming up, and there was this music club. They were just practicing, but there were probably 15 musicians in there, so I just went in and sat down and had a beer and spent an hour listening to some wonderful music from all these guys. And that's very common in other clubs there. These would be Cuba's equivalent of the Spanish Steps in Rome. You know those. This is called Pico Padre, Little Father, and it's not nearly as nice as the Spanish Steps, but they lay claim to this. That's a big deal for them.
Nightclub?
El Dragon, no, it's not a nightclub. It's a tienda, store of some sort. And we are still in Santiago. This is one of the, I don't know what town, it's a small town outside of Santiago. This is the worst basketball court in the world. I think. Fun to watch, but boy, it's a long time between shots sometimes. And this again, I was walking down the street and the dental offices are open. So I was actually standing outside looking in and taking pictures of people doing dental work. It's not something you see here, so for me it was good. And this is San Lazaro, and every December there's people crawl from Havana 20 miles to the Church of San Lazaro, where they pay homage to him, and so that's a very big deal in the Santeria. And this is in, where do we start? This is the Moncada Barracks. And in 1953, Fidel Castro and 80-some men attacked it. It was an army barracks, and he attacked it, and I think 18 of them lived. All the rest were killed. And then Fidel and his brother were jailed and sent to the Isle of Pines, which was a prison island, basically. And after 2 years, he gave a speech called "History Will Absolve Me," and he was released because people reacted so much to the speech. They released him, but they sent him to Mexico, which is where he met Che Guevara, which is where he formulated the revolution and came back to fight the revolution, and starting in this part of the country. He grew up in the mountains in the east. And so the 26th, it was on the 26th at the top means 26th of July, which was the day they attacked. So that's our 4th of July is their 26th of July. Vice versa, their 26th of July is our 4th of July. So now this is a school and a museum and a very interesting place, and they still have the bullet holes in the walls. These are all the men who were killed in that attack.
So you spoke with a lot of people who were alive during the, I assume, during the revolution and subsequently, and what's their level of enthusiasm about Cuba?
Well, it sort of depends on who you talk to. It's very mixed. I mean, all my friends who go I've been going from 96 till now, so 18 years. And the question has always been, well, now it's not so much the question, but if there was an election, would Fidel win? And nobody seems to be able to answer that. I mean, I'm going back 10 years when he was healthy and still running the country. Because he has a lot of popularity in many ways, but there's a lot of frustration, particularly among the young people who see other things but yet even those people take pride in some of the things he does, like he protects children. He puts all his effort into healthcare and education, so they admire a lot of what he does, but they're very frustrated. And if you want to make money, you can't. I mean,
Aren't they beginning to have some individual capitalistic?
Oh yeah, there's a bunch now. That's very recent. Yeah, there's a whole bunch. And we'll get to that in a little bit. This is a quinceañera. 15, yeah. So. And this is only funny because that says danger of collapse, and he's sitting there. So. Good place to sit. And this is the only basilica. This is outside Santiago de Cuba. Pretty spectacular building, I thought, so, and this is the approach to it as you come up from Santiago. And this is, now we're in Playa Baracoa, or in Baracoa, that far easternmost. I actually flew in there, and then was able to take that new road back up through the mountains, which was pretty interesting. But this was the Columbus Cross, claiming that Columbus brought this in 1492 to Cuba, although it's in some dispute, but the people in Cuba swear by it, so I'll go with that. This is the view from up on the hill of the entry to Baracoa, and what's interesting is on that spit of land across the harbor entrance is the landing strip. You can sort of see there, so when you fly in, you can't be short, you can't be long. A pretty interesting flight. So. And now this is up in the mountains above that where it's very poor. These are people who probably grow coffee beans or almonds or something for a living. So this is the real poor end of life. And they, I guess, choose to live in the mountains and want to stay that way. So now we move back up. We're getting closer to Havana, up along the north coast. This is the city of Remedios, and we have in Ann Arbor a sister city with Remedios, which a friend of mine and I put together about 15 years ago. A very interesting, very historical city that's sort of off the beaten path, so not a lot of tourism, but a lot of history. And every year on Christmas Eve they have Las Parandas, which is, they build huge floats, and they have teams, and they shoot fireworks at each other. It's extremely dangerous and insane. It goes on all night long. It goes on until the sun comes out. And they fight, people get hurt every year and hauled off in ambulances, and that's their big, I guess they let loose by doing that. And this is the second church in that city, and this one's famous for all the gilt walls at the back of the church. And I may have a picture of that here, and I may not. It took me a long time to find it. This is actually Veradero Beach, which I've only been to once, and it's the tourist beach. And at this time, the only Cubans that could go there were Cubans that worked there. And it's basically a tourist resort, 5-star hotels, families come on family plans and do all that, which is just absolutely no interest to me, but I just wanted to see it, so that's my one picture of Veradero Beach. So, but I figure if you want to go to that, you might as well just go to Florida. You're not going to interact with the people. This is the city of Matanzas, close to that, just an interesting, lots of roads.
And that's the first building I saw with paint.
Pardon me?
That's the first building I saw
Yeah,
with
and I'll bring that up a bit too.
Okay, because I've been
they've
all
discovered
over Latin
paint.
America,
They've
and I
discovered
never
paint.
saw lack of
You
paint.
see some over here. I think I have some. This is a family that I met. They had this beautiful old house, and I started talking to them. This is a mother and daughter in the city of Ceiba Mocha, a real small town. And what I like to do is drive to a town, park, and just walk around for 2 or 3 or 4 hours and see who I can talk to. So that's sort of what I do. And that's part of that. And this is her house on the inside, a very classic colonial house. And this is the end of town. Just ends all of a sudden. This house is not very, it is painted, right? This is painted. This is the house of the family of Elian Gonzalez. If any of you remember, he's the raft boy who was over here. And this was actually taken, I wanted to find his house, but he was still in the States when I took this picture. So I went down and found it. It's off the beaten path of ways. And I did meet his teacher and some other, that's his teacher. I met her and talked to a few people, but he was not back yet. So. And now, we're going to go briefly to Playa Baracoa, apparently. That's what my little red star says. And Playa Baracoa is on the far east. And Playa Baracoa, where the red star is was a beach town, and it was for rich habaneros, people from Havana, to go in the summer because it was a little bit cooler, so it was all wooden cottages. And I was very interested in wooden cottages. So I was documenting them for several years, just going there, taking pictures of all these wooden houses. Got to know a lot of people there. This is, I call this the point houses. When you come into town, this is on the point. Some beautiful houses. And then a section of my book is dedicated to this town. And 3 hurricanes over the course of about 15 months wiped out almost everything in town. All of the people that I know are still there. No one was killed. Most of the houses are gone and they've been replaced. Like this house is literally on the ocean. This is the street side we're looking at. To the left is the street, but to the right is the ocean. They're 10 feet in the ocean. So, but this house is mostly gone. I think the bottom half stayed. That's another very nice house, and this is across the street from the ocean. This is mentioned earlier that I buy and sell art, and this guy, I saw this house with a bunch of painting on the walls, just some pretty artistic stuff, and I knocked on the door, and I said, who's the artist here? His father came, I said, oh, my son, and he does some painting, so I got to know him a little bit. His name is Eric, and he's one of the artists that I buy. The picture at the bottom right, where you can just see the woman's face, is one that I own. So I bought some pieces from him. I try to buy only from people I know, so I support my friends. And so this is still Playa Baracoa, my favorite little town here. And again, just oceanfront. This is the house, I can't think of his name now, but her husband passed away since I took this. And this is a mismatch. Okay, now we're in Havana, which is where I spend my time mostly, home away from home. So I'm just going to roll through these, and I'm not going to. This is already directly. The Capitol, which you see in this previous picture, the Capitol Dome, is a replica of the U.S. Capitol. So if you go up there, you think you're in a dream world of some sort. Right across the street, this is the view from the steps of the Capitol. So that's where we are, right in the heart of Havana. And I like this view because some of you are my age, and if you remember the cartoon cars that crawled like this, remember those? That's what I mean. There's one. Panaderia, little bakery, some nice little decor. This is in Old and Central Havana, which are the historic sections of town. And I'll read you some of the information on the historic part in a second. So, and you see the mix of architecture, tremendous number of influences, and as I said, the good part is none of it got torn down, even though some of it's in very bad shape. This is typical. When a car breaks down, they fix it wherever it breaks down. There are not that many garages and repair shops, so I'm just going to sort of wing through these. These were friends of mine that invited me to dinner, so this is a typical Cuban meal.
So these
pork,
folks,
and black beans and rice, pork, tomato, avocado, green beans. That's pretty standard fare.
do these folks have family in rural districts as well?
Almost all of them have some family in rural districts. And it's funny because I've traveled with people and they'll say, oh, I'll just stay with, I have a cousin there, I'll go stay with him. So I had a driver that took me a couple places, and he said, oh, no, I know people that I'll just stay with them, or I have somebody there that's, so they're connected in many ways. So it's a typical, this is again from outside looking into the house. These are a bunch of mugs, look at these guys. They called me from across the street to take their picture. This I just call 3 generations. Some of the quirky architecture. And this, when I first went, was a hole in the ground, and the only building was the tall one on the far right, and the blue one next to it, which is Phototeca, which is where I had my show. Those were the only 2 buildings that had been repaired. Everything else was just held up by sticks and looked terrible. So that's what they've done over the course of these years. Is the entirety of Old Havana is a World Heritage Site, so there's money pouring in to repair all these places, so they do a great job. And this is where I like to be, just in the streets, and in the middle of it, in the thick of it. People are always out, so there's always someone to talk to. And this is Old Havana, you can tell by the narrow streets. Barbershop. And this artist, I just loved his artwork, and then I photographed it and seen it several places. And it turns out it's 2 brothers from Brazil who are actually pretty famous, which I had no idea, but that's sort of cool. School kids in uniforms, of course. This is Central Havana, which is slightly newer than Old Havana, but still pretty old. And this is where that's my favorite part of town, is Central. This was a hair fashion show that I just ran into, and then you never know what you run into. Some pretty bizarre stuff, but lots of fun. This was an artist that I met. I went to a friend's house, and she had a singer over, and then a couple of friends, and I started talking to him, and he said he had a gallery across the harbor in Havana. So the next day I went over to meet him, and I stopped in a church on the way, and one of my favorite churches, in fact, maybe that's maybe. And they have a lot of art in this church, and it's the Church of the Black Virgin. It's a beautiful, small wooden church right on the harbor. So I went in, I was looking at this beautiful piece, and I went to see him, and he says, oh, I just painted it for the church, so small world sometimes. This is his kitchen. This is called Regla, which is a part of Havana, but it's across the harbor. I'm sorry?
We went past the kitchen so fast, it looked like
Well,
art.
we can go back.
They painted all that
Yeah.
stuff too, probably.
Lots of stuff.
Wow.
And dominoes is everywhere.
Oh my God, look at that.
This is my friend Pablo, who just passed away, sadly. I've known him for 10 years. And he makes these little crosses by hand and sells them in the churches. He died at 83, I think, and he was still making crosses until the end. And he has a room, which may or may not be in here. This is his bedroom, and if you go back through his bedroom to the back room, he has a workshop, which is a couple of benches, and he opens the cabinets, and he has every Stanley tool from the 50s. It looks like it's never been used. They're all sharpened, and he knows the price that he paid for every single tool. There's a black and white picture of him in the book that talks about that a little bit, so another just interesting architectural. This would have been a party, either a birthday or a quince or something in the street, some leftover stuff. There's a classic Cadillac. And this is, do you guys know, what's his name? This is the guy that did Heidelberg Project in Detroit.
Yeah.
Tyree Gunn.
Tyree Guyton, yeah. I just talked to him the other day. This is Cuba's Tyree Guyton.
Cool.
Salvadoran. He has painted 3 blocks, 3 stories high. Painted up, and a lot of it's Santeria. This is what is that? So it's a very famous
Yeah, it's Tyree.
This is some church that I could never get inside. And I went in once. I looked up, and this was the ceiling, which I thought was pretty spectacular and very dark. So this is with my camera on my forehead, laying in the aisle, hoping to get something. As you can see it. Well, this is the Church of the Black Virgin, by the way, that I talked about earlier. Beautiful churches. I was raised Catholic, and I'm no longer Catholic, but I'm always fascinated by the iconography of the church and the architecture of the church. And I always say I love being in churches when they're empty. So I spend a lot of time, if I find an open church, I always went, then they're cool. So when you're sweating on the streets all day, it's a nice place to go. This is the oldest church in Cuba, from Plaza Catedral. And the way I got up here was I was in another church a day or 2 earlier, and I met this guy, and he says, oh, I'm the bell ringer at Catedral. He says, if you want to come at such and such a time on Sunday or whatever day it was, I'll take you up there. So I said, okay. So we went, and the bells are behind us, the brass bells, and he rings. And then he runs across these ledges and opens and closes these windows, and I couldn't even watch him. It made me nervous. And he was older than I am and more nimble. It's another church, San Francisco. That's all Campo Real at the back. The sides are pillars with the back is trumpet. And this is, I mentioned, the people that go to San Lazaro in December. This man is leaving Havana, dragging rocks, and with this symbol there, and he's going to crawl 20 miles to San Lazaro for the festival.
Is that St. Lazarus? Is that Buddhist? Lazarus?
Well,
Lazarus?
they're parallels. So they've taken all the saints were paralleled with all the orishas of the Yoruba. So that's how they were able to keep their religions. Because
Oh,
sort of
that's interesting.
Santa Barbara would become something else. So that's how they kept it all together. And this is only because this is Cemetery of the World, which is, I think, the number 3 cemetery in the world. Just a gorgeous, spectacular, huge place in the middle of Havana. And this is, I can't think of what they call her, Mia Rosa. Miracle woman. And the story behind her is that she was buried with this infant at her feet, and when they disinterred her years later, the baby was in her arms. So people go there, and there's nothing in the whole cemetery, and then there's 100 people lined up and putting coins and flowers and knocking on the, so she's very famous. And this is Santeria. They don't have churches. So if you go in someone's house, they'll have a cabinet like this, and they'll open up, and that's the altar. So all the things in there symbolize all the Afro-Cuban aspects of their religion. This would be a Santana. In fact, I went there, she cast the shells to tell me my future. We've all lived it, so far so good. So Santa Rita, and this is, again, I met a woman who was a Santana, and I went to her house for a birthday party for Chango, who was one of the main saints, and they were supposed to do some sacrifices, but didn't because the plumbing had gone out. They couldn't wash up afterwards. But they did go into the chanting and into in the fits, and they could be awakened from that. So it's fascinating to watch. And this is an herb cellar, and a lot of this is for Santeria as well. Use these herbs for all kinds of things. I have a sacrifice coming up, which might be now, so if you don't like sacrifices, brace yourself. Yeah. This is a goat, and I was actually invited to this ceremony, and I was sitting on the floor, and I'd been there about 3 hours. If you don't want to look at this, look at me. In any case, so they brought this goat out, and for an hour or so they bathed him in powders and herbs and all this stuff, and they parade him around, and then they start chanting and dancing and going in circles and round and round and round and round, and just builds and builds and builds. And then the machetero with the machete comes out, and he starts dancing around and around and around. And by then it's 11 o'clock at night and dark, and my batteries are dying. So I just sit there and I go, well, I need to get one picture. And as the machetero runs by, he just takes a single swing and just keeps moving. So I push the button and just caught it where the guy's out of the picture, and I don't think the head is even touching the floor yet completely. So I like to say the goat doesn't know that he's dead yet, but that's how they do the sacrifices. And then after that, they actually prepare the goat, cook them, and they cook them all night, and in the morning they eat. So, but that's a goat sacrifice. Now you know, there's two beauties. That's easier to look at. Birthday cakes, pretty classy, pretty fancy. This is an old Cunningham store. There's not much in it, but they still have green fluorescence. That's the good part. Another counter at another, this was not a Cunningham's, it would have been a dime store of some sort at one time, so they still have the counter on over. This is Central Havana, which I love so much, and you can see some of the buildings are starting to be painted, and then that's the ocean you see at the end. So it's a beautiful part of town. The Malecon runs all across 5 or 6 miles of the edge of town. So, this is my friend Luis. He's a little crazy. I forget how many piercings he has, but the last time I saw him, he had a leg amputated. He said, "Oh, motorcycle accident." I met a friend of mine down the street. He said, "No, he had gangrene. They just cut his leg off." So he's slowly being whittled away. This is only funny because my daughter has been to Cuba 20 times. She's 29 years old, and at this point, this was 10 or 12 years ago, she had been going down and met a guy down there who was a salsa dancer who she had a relationship with, and I had a girlfriend, and she had a boyfriend, so we would go down together and we'd hang out. So at this particular time, they rented an apartment right near where I stay, and they invited us over for dinner. And when she said, "I'm gonna get something to drink," and she came up with this ACT vodka, and it's from Peoria, Illinois, America's corn tradition. And because it's a farm product, they can sell it in Cuba. So, corn vodka. Got me. Sidecars are pretty common. It's a friend of mine's kitchen. She's in my book too with this picture of her son. I'll show you that if we get to the book. Typesetters, they're actually setting type to those the old-fashioned way. This is in the Gran Teatro, and they're painting backdrops. This is a huge and gorgeous building with several theaters inside. This is on the top floor where they paint all the backdrops. Beautiful building. This is my wife's son on the right, and we were at a beach called Tarara, which is part of the Playas del Este, which means it's the eastern part of Havana, but the beaches of Havana, not way out in the tourist areas. And I see he's playing with these guys, and I go, "These are not Cubans, what's going on here?" So I talked to my wife and girlfriend at the time, and she said, "No, they're Chernobyl kids." And what they did was the Cubans sent a plane over and brought all the kids that were having these thyroid conditions and brought them over to this beach area and built a hospital for them, just for Chernobyl victims. Wow. And they continue to do that to this day, although they don't do the flights anymore, but they do the care. So you go to this beach and you always see these Russian, they're not Cuban looking, so pretty interesting. This is open heart surgery today. I won't show you any hearts. This is where I was shooting the surgery. This is my doctor friend on the right, who is a very good friend. He's in my book as well. And this is my Fidel picture. I'll show you. I think, if I can find it. I only took this as close as I got, although I have a red hat here. That's Fidel with his hand in the air. Now you know, my buddy. So my Fidel story briefly is, I mentioned we had a sister city with Cuba, and I was in the Toronto airport and I ran into Lisa Volante, and Lisa Volante is the head of all the sister cities for all the United States with Cuba. And she said, this week we're going to do a state to province for the first time, Pennsylvania to Matanzas province. She said, if you want to come, you should come. We're going to have a little dinner on Friday. I think this was a Sunday. I think I was only there for a week, Sunday to Sunday, or 10 days maybe. And I said, well, I might come. She said, I don't know where we're going to be, but I know that town enough. It's about 50 miles from Havana, but I'm sure that I could have found it. But I'd been across the country most of the time. And I came back into Havana on Thursday, and I was leaving on Sunday. And I said, well, should I go to Matanzas and try to find these people and take pictures and have fun, or should I just do what I need to do in Havana? He says, well, I'm just going to stay in Havana. So I stay in Havana. Don't go to the dinner. And on Sunday, I get on the plane, and when you get on the plane in Cuba, they hand you Grandma, which is their paper. And on the front page of the paper is Lisa Volante with Fidel and Oliver Stone, who showed up at the dinner and sat at the table for an hour, where I could have been. So I missed my hour with Fidel. So this is all I have. This is it. This is a very famous house. What happened after the revolution is people never lost their homes. So if you had a mansion and you lived there by yourself, the government would not take your house. It wouldn't take your bank accounts. So there are lots of people who stayed and were wealthy, and in fact, I have a very good book about that called 7 Women of the Revolution, who elected to stay, and all were pleased with their choice. But in any case, this house is just a very prominent spot in Havana, and I've been watching it for years, and part of the roof is missing, and it is tourist, but part of it's gone. And somebody said you can't go in there, nobody will let you in, and so I tried to get in. One time I didn't get in, I went back another time. There's a woman named Luisa, who was 73, who lived there with her niece, and I started talking to the niece, and finally wormed my way into the house. And I ended up touring the whole house and photographing all the rooms. This has a library off to the side, and yet part of the roof is missing. And upstairs there's a bedroom, and the next bedroom has no roof in it. So, and since then, Luisa passed away, and the government took it over. Now it looks like a brand new house for tourists. So new one has a green tile roof, and it's beautiful, but it'll never be as beautiful as it was at this point. I met a woman walking down the street with her mother, and the woman was very beautiful, and she was a dancer in one of the reviews. So leggy, so I was flirting with her, and we walked back to where they lived, and she said, can you come tomorrow, because my niece has her first birthday tomorrow. So I ended up coming back the next day, so this is the first birthday party for her niece. And her niece is now 19, and I just took a picture of her on my last trip. So interesting how these stay together. And there's happy and sad, I guess. This I just call romance. This is the Malecon, the walkway. And there's Che Tattoo, of course. A lot of these are just faces that I find interesting and fascinating. So this was a woman who was sitting on the stoop in the street, and she smiled, but she was missing some teeth, so she put her head down because she was so shy. And then that was a better picture. Again, the Malecon goes all along the edge of the city, and of course the young boys flirting with the girls, pretty normal. This is where I first stayed, Hotel Inglaterra, which is right next to the Gran Teatro, which is right next to the Capitol, which is right across from Central Park. So a great location, and I stayed there my first 2 trips until I got oriented. And that's the Gran Teatro we talked about, where we saw the backdrops being painted upstairs, and then you see all the cars in front, and those are actually taxis, Cuban taxis. So they utilize them. They're not there for show, but they're extremely utilitarian because they hold so many people. So and a lot of them have kerosene engines or whatever they make them work. This picture's been published a number of times, I'm not sure what the attraction was. That's in there. Another beauty shop. Beauty of a beauty shop.
A lot of these buildings all look like old Spanish old European. Were they built by the Spanish, were they built
No,
by
there's a
Batistas?
lot of influence, Deco, Moorish, I mean, there's a whole bunch of influences there, because there was so much money that came through Havana. I mean, it was, everything that came into the Western
Spanish
Hemisphere came through Havana for
Through the
years.
Spanish
And
main, too.
Spain, and then partly, and then France for a while, and Britain for a while, but mostly Spain, but all these, so much
During
money came
Batista's
through.
time, were these buildings taken care of and stuff, and was this a
Well,
the city?
the people that had money, the people that were poor.
Right, and
So,
nothing.
I mean, depends on what side you were on, I guess.
Yeah.
The fancier ones were taken care of, but,
Okay.
I mean, that was a time where there was no education for the poor and no
Yeah.
healthcare for the poor. This is actually the Palacio de Matrimonios, and every Saturday at 4 o'clock, they have weddings there, and I used to go to weddings just for fun, to take pictures, and so that was part of the fun. This one I just call Wary Grandmother. There's a couple of dangerous women, and that grandmother's keeping an eye on them. And this looks like an illusion, but it's actually a sidewalk. The sidewalk's on the right and the street is on the left, although now it's a walking street. But it's also part of my spandex series. Back in the 90s, everyone wore spandex, whether they should or not. It's awesome.
That looks like a Van
And
Gogh.
this is actually my '56 Chevy that broke down in some small town about 30 miles outside of Havana. And we found this guy to take the starter motor out and saw off something and weld on something else and put it back together. And off we went a couple hours later for about $10. So that's typical. This is my very first trip to Cuba. I went to a small town outside of Havana because I didn't want to just be in Havana. And I met a man there who toured me around. This is one of the care centers that they have every year. So it's not the top care, of course, but community clinics, basically. And farmers, all farm workers. Again, along the Malecon, there's the Capitol, a better view of it. This is a night shot. This is now a museum, and it was one of the social clubs from Asturianos, from parts of Spain. They all had social clubs in Havana, very wealthy social clubs. It was a social club, and then it became a public bathroom. And when I first started going there, you couldn't even walk back because it smelled terrible. And they completely restored it, and now it's an international museum and gorgeous. These guys sit in front of the Capitol. You guys are photographers, right?
Mhm.
Here's the challenge for you. These guys have these box cameras, and inside there's chemistry, and they take 8 by 10 sheets of paper and cut them into 4 by 5, and they take a picture of you on this piece of paper. They develop it in there, and then they take it out, and you see that wooden piece on the front that's hanging down. They flip that up, put the picture there, and then they take a picture of that picture, so you have a positive. So you have a paper negative and a positive, and it costs $1. So I got to know some of these guys. Here's actually taking a picture of the negative version of it. So I did a whole series. That's the negative positive. I did a whole series of these things. Well, this is Roberto Salas on the left, who is very famous, and we're still very good friends. I just talked to him a couple days ago, and I'm doing some business with him, actually bringing more of his photos up. And Mario Diaz, who was the head of the Phototeca where I had my show. And this is the famous Corda at the left, who took the famous Che photo, which is at the bottom of the page, where he's with me. This is a picture from my book. The black and white picture that he's holding. That's my daughter, and that's him looking at her, and that's the picture that he gave her as a gift. And then this is Roberto Salas in the middle, and Raul Corrales on the right, and those are sort of the big three of the epic Cuban photographers. That's a great group of guys here. And this is sort of funny because it's in every body, revolution in every corner, and it doesn't look very revolutionary. Pretty mellow. That's my Chevy. There you go. And my uncle in the Cartagena cigar factory. This is the local boxing gym named after Kid Chocolate, who was a very famous boxer in the 40s and 50s. They still have exhibitions there all the time. I've been to a couple of those. And this, right in the middle of Havana, a mile from where I stayed, there's a bridge, and one day I went under the bridge, and there I found this vegetative, this beautiful vegetation, rather spectacular, right in the middle of the city filled with cement and not much else. Pretty amazing. This is Adihio, who is the grandfather of a friend of mine and a pretty famous artist, so we went to his house and he was showing us some of his work. And that is a Chinese hairless. Life is better as a blonde. And here's spandex and old cars. This is sort of good mix of 52 or 53 Chrysler and some spandex. Fishing in the Malecon. This is a woman named Connor Gorey, and she wrote the Lonely Planet Guide to Cuba. And I just met her my last trip. She actually has my book in her hand, so we're new friends. She just opened a coffee shop not too far from where I stay in Havana, so I went there a couple times and had some great conversation. Very interesting woman. And another good friend of mine wrote the Moon Travel Guide to Cuba. So no travel guide writers. Whatever good that is, I don't know. This is Gregorio Fuentes at 102 years old, and he was Hemingway's boat captain and supposedly the model for the Old Man in the Sea. This is at his home outside of Havana, and he was still pretty lucid when I saw him. He died at 104, 2 years after this. This is a daycare center. Again, I mentioned Fidel loves kids, so kids get very well taken care of. They get a quart of milk every day till they're 5. They get bread every day delivered to them. Daycare is available to everyone. So the University of Havana, which is a pretty amazing university. They are famous for giving free education. This is inside the university up top there, one of the lecture halls. They're famous, before I get to this picture, they're famous for giving free education to anyone in the Americas who can't afford to get a medical degree. Sorry. If you want to be a doctor and you can't. I actually hosted a party for a woman from Detroit, Mary Knight, who was going down for a 5-year program, and there's no cost. When you graduate, your only requirement is to spend 2 years in an underserved area in your own country. So in other words, after she was done, she'd have to go to Detroit or wherever and serve for 2 years in an underserved community. That's the only cost. They pay room and board, books, tuition, full education. What they found is this program started a dozen years ago. But they found that almost everybody passes their medical boards on the first try or second try. They get a really good education. There was a lot of doubt initially, but it's been very successful. And this is La Isa, Instituto Superior de Artes, and this was a golf course when Fidel came into power in 1959, and he and Che Guevara were golfing there, and some very famous pictures of that. And at the end of the day, he said, this would make a great art institute. He closed the golf course, and he created 3 campuses on this golf course, and had international architects come in and design the building. So there's 3 separate complexes on a huge old golf course. So that's pretty cool. This is Masora. The joke in Cuba is I have to go to Masora because this is the mental hospital. And I was given a tour of that. The director is the man on the right. And what they've done differently from the time of Batista is they get everybody up and they give everybody a job. They have a baseball diamond, they have music groups, they have symphony orchestras. They make everybody do something. Everybody gets up, everybody does something. At the end of my tour, which was a couple hours, he said, come into the auditorium, and they put on a floor show just for me. I was the only audience member, and they sang songs and they did dances. Just stunning what they did. So very cool. And then they had pictures of how it used to be before, when people would chain to their beds. So just the changes. So something more cheery is cigars. I don't smoke them, but that's the sign for the Partagas Cigar Factory. That's the factory. This woman is, I took this picture on an early trip, and I'd never seen her before, but since then I've seen her, because she's famous now for working there. But I've never seen her with a cigar that long. Usually there's short little, 2-inch stubs, but I just caught her, she must have just lit that one, so it's a little obscene, but pretty fun. So this is a tour of the factory. I was in a small town, I noticed they had all these mannequins and they were all damaged, but I thought it was a perfect metaphor for Cuba, the utilitarian manner in which they use things. They're not gonna worry about painting the face, if it serves the purpose, they put it out there. So I did a whole series of mannequins, which are pretty much fun, a wild looking group here. And that's really the end. There's some shots in my book, but this is another time my car broke down. For $5, this guy turned the axle and welded it back to the wheel, and we walked back to the car and put it back together and drove home. American Gothic, or Cuban Gothic, rather. This is the cover of my book. I just went through these. Carlos Valdez, Santa Havana, Diving on the Malecon, Summer Love, I call this. I'm actually again on the sidewalk, walking by, and I just looked in and I went, don't move. Picture. Here's here's Pablo the Crossmaker. You can see all the tools on both sides, and he said I paid $2.07 for that in 1956, and I thought this wonderful guy. This is sort of emblematic: dominoes, soccer in the streets, church in the background, so you have a little bit of all the different aspects. This is one I have on display here. This I call the boys. These look like a bunch of tough guys, and they call you over and all start smiling and ask you to take the picture. So if you ask the people to let you take your picture, they ask you. This one I call New Bride. She was actually sitting outside of that Palacio de Matrimonio that we talked about earlier, sitting on the back of a convertible, and her husband disappeared on her for a minute, so she had a great look on her face. This young girl, Dionelle, is blind in her left eye, and she was out, it was very hot, and she was jumping in this is by one of the big hotels. They have a waterfall in front, so the kids go play there, they're not supposed to. And I got her address, and I actually went back and found her, and she's a scholar and an athlete, and met her family. Just a beautiful young woman, so that was very nice to be able to follow up that. I dedicate my book to Walker Evans, who did a book in 1950, in the 1950s of Cuba, and this would have been typical of something he would have shot, and now he said you could put this in his book and you would never know the difference. He did a lot of work with signage, people on the streets, so that's good. Shade tattoo, and my daughter with Corda. In the end. So I will gladly take questions about Cuba, obviously, or if you want to talk about anything else, publishing, if you want to talk about the other things that I do, let me tell you briefly what I do. I do Cuba. You figured that out. I do nudes, which I've been doing forever, and I love doing nudes, and I will always do nudes. I do commercial photography to make a living. That's how I make my living. And I do Ann Arbor street fashion. One day a week I walk around Ann Arbor and I take pictures of people on the street and I post a page. It's a Facebook page called Ann Arbor Street Photography. So those are the 4 aspects of my photographic life. Apparently my whole life is photographic, apparently. So that's, and I can show you a website or any things if you want to get into that, but that's not necessary. And questions, we're going to start where?
Just curiosity, is it possible to do a tour? I know a lot of the tourists are really strictly limited, but is it possible to do a tour of Cuba where it's more or less free-flowing and to travel through the length of the island?
Technically not, but in reality, yes. I mean, that's what I do.
Well, yeah, but you've been there so many times.
I know, but I mean, you could technically, a lot of people just go there illegally. Nobody gets in trouble anymore, by the way. That's pretty much a thing of the past. They used to find people, but I don't think they find anybody in 8 years now, something like that. And if people contest the fines, they never show up in court because no judges will listen to them because they're so ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really no big fear. I mean, I want to tell people to break the law, but you can just go on your own or find another person to go with or whatever you want to do and do it that way. The tours are pretty tightly regulated, and they keep trying to strangle them more all the time. But you have to talk to the Cubans in Miami about that. The Miami Mafia is in charge of all that stuff. So they control that. But if you go on those tours, they pretty much want you to stick to the people. Some don't. I mean, they just go screw it, I'm going somewhere. They can't do much to you.
Yeah, a friend of ours did a tour. It was supposed to be a church tour, so they were not allowed to go to the beach.
Right, yeah.
And so I'm just curious as to
Well, I
whether
see these tour groups, and I call them pods, because there's 12 to 15 people. They move around like this, and they all take the same picture. So
yeah,
to me, it's just, they're awful, and they make you sort of stay with your group. So to me, takes me off the list, you know. So I just wandering. And so you can go on your own and do what you want, and you can contact me if you want to talk more about that. I mean, I
Because
go,
I don't speak Spanish, so it's.
well, that makes it harder,
Yes.
but not impossible. I mean, there's, some people speak English, not a lot, especially away from Havana. In Havana, a lot more people speak English.
That was my question, because I saw a couple of bars that said bar, and I just
Yeah.
wondered how much English was spoken.
Well, the bars, they use that word for bar, so that's
Oh.
part of it. And I think I'm seeing more English, but sometimes I go and I don't speak English the whole time I'm there. And maybe it's just because I'm automatically speaking Spanish, and maybe they would speak English if I did. But it's not as prevalent as you would think, not like in Europe or other places. A lot of people speak.
What's crime like in, say, Havana, the big cities?
I say it's about the danger equivalent is about the same as Ann Arbor. 2 million plus people. When my daughter was 14, I said, if you want to go out by yourself, you can. It's pretty safe. The crime is largely property crime. So if you have a camera on you're swinging a camera on somebody, can buy a bike and swipe it. They might knock you down in the process, but they're not going to. If they hurt a tourist or do something to a tourist, they're in deep trouble. Cuba does
Is there
not
much
tolerate that.
panhandling? I mean, or, I know
Well,
there are
there's
lot
a
of
fair,
tourists.
there's more all the time, the more tourism they have. When I first started going, there was not very much. And I could take people's pictures and they all said, fine, great. Now you say, can I take your picture? And they go $1. So there's a lot of it, but the kids will panhandle and they're all pretty healthy. I mean, you look at them and you go, you know, this kid is not starving. He's got a big fat belly and big round face and he's doing pretty well. So it's not like I mean, they want candy and they want stuff like that, but they're not starving and, dying in the streets. You don't see that much, especially with kids. Kids are very well taken care of.
Are there many Europeans in Havana?
Well, the biggest tourist group are Canadians. They built the airport, and I think 2 million a year go down. But there's a lot of Italians, a lot of Spanish, Argentinians, Mexicans. There's a fair amount of tourists. It's their number one business is tourism.
And are Cubans traveling in South America, Europe?
Well, as of the first of the year, they can come and go freely pretty much. They can't come to the States because the States won't let them.
Yeah.
The Cubans will let them come here if they want to come. And that's pretty new. Before you had to get an exit visa, and those were hard to get and a pain in the neck. Now, if you just graduated from medical school there as a Cuban, they're not going to give you an exit visa because they think you're just not going to come back, and they just invested 5 years in your education. So some people are more restricted, but just the average Cuban, if they want to travel, can pretty much go anywhere they want, except the States because of the States, not because of Cuba.
I had 2 questions. One, somebody told me that it's actually not illegal for Americans to go to Cuba, but it's illegal for them to spend American money
Well,
there. Is that something that I just...
well, the law, it's all bullshit, basically. The law is the Trading with the Enemy Act, which means you can't spend any money in Cuba. Now, years ago, we decided, well, we'll just change our money for Canadian money, and then you take
That's what I was
Canadian money to
wondering.
Cuba. But then they also had, if you were fully hosted by the Cubans, you could go. But even that, they tried to do. They still try to, regardless of what you do. They go, well, you changed American money for Canadian money, so you still technically spend. I mean, they still. But the fact is, they don't do anything anymore.
Okay.
So you just go and you do lose 10% on the dollar because they used to use U.S. dollars there, but now they have Cuban convertible pesos, and they give you 90 cents on every U.S. dollar. So you lose 10%.
The other question I had, you said that if people had the money, that they kept it. Is there like a wealthy class there? or
Well,
is
not
it
a lot,
everybody?
not a lot, because over time they weren't making money. So they spend what they have, but there's still people out here with lots of money, and I've been in homes that are really beautiful. I met an artist guy who had a little shop in Old Havana, and he said, you want to see some of my art? And he locked the door and we went upstairs, and he must have had millions of dollars worth of art upstairs in his.
But they don't have like a separate group of people?
Well,
like,
there's some nice neighborhoods. I don't go there too much because they're sort of off the beaten path and there's sort of not much, nothing happens there. I like where all the people are. So if you go into the other older neighborhoods, people are outside all the time, much more interesting. Even where I stay, it's sort of genteel. although it's within walking distance of all the different areas I want to go to. It's the perfect location for me. But I have more fun away from that location if I want to really go out and take pictures.
Yeah.
So the government is the main employer of people, or maybe the only
Well,
real employer of people?
The only employer up until recently. They started, actually several years back, 10 years back, after they opened up tourism, they opened up low-level capitalism. So like the place that I rent is a person's home, and it's a legal rental, and he pays taxes every month, and he rents me a room. The average Cuban makes $20 a month. He probably makes $20 a day. So he does very well.
So is there more of that going on now?
Well, there's a lot more of that, and now they've opened up a whole bunch of new stuff. In fact, the last couple of times I was down there, there's shop after shop, dress shops, clothing shops, anything you can think of. I mean, just everything, but they're all real small, it's just low key. And the restaurants used to only be able to have 12 seats and only hire family members. They've changed all that, so the restaurants are getting bigger, and they're hiring more people, and they're getting fancier. And there are more and more rooms for rent all over. In areas where there were never any rooms for rent, there are rooms for rent. So there's a lot going on, but they're still filtering it out. I mean, sure, there's gonna be a lot of failures in this. People just can't figure it out. And others who will do really well. I mean, like I said, my friend, the writer, opened a coffee shop. She married a Cuban 12 years ago, and they have a coffee shop bookstore. It's been open like 3 or 4 months, but it was a great place to go. It was really nice. So there's a lot of that going on, a lot of change.
It was on PBS program.
We hear that they're doing remarkably well in terms of literacy, better than we are.
Yes.
But what is the press like, and how familiar are people with what's going on in the rest of the world?
People are very worldly, so they get a lot of international news. Inter-Cuba news is more word of mouth because the press is very limited. I would say artists have a lot of freedom of expression though, so you find there's a lot of protest that comes from writers and artists of all sorts that actually speak out, and you go, whoa, did he really say that? And he did, and he's still there, So they're allowing freedom of expression a lot more, but as far as the press itself, it's still pretty restricted. I mean, the only papers are the government papers, Rebelde for the youth, and then Grandma, which is the main paper. So it's a mix, but people know what's going on in the world. I mean, it's remarkable.
Do they get their news from the United States or from other
No,
countries?
they don't get it from the United States at all.
Yeah.
Cuba's television is
somewhere
primarily news and movies and education. It's very limited time-wise, like the noon news hour and the evening news hour. And then they have movies, like US movies on Friday nights, current movies that they don't have to pay for. So when the news gets out, I was there on 9/11, I was in Cuba. And I was supposed to come home on the 12th. And on the 11th in the morning, I woke up and I went out and sat on the porch like I usually do in the morning, and there was a guy from Canada there. He said, oh, Duena, the woman who has the house, said, a plane hit a building in New York, and oh man. And then we were talking a little bit, he said something about maybe another plane hit, and I went, whoa, what does that mean? But I didn't think too much about it, and I was actually going to deliver, I think I had a floppy disk at the time, I was going to take to someone that I didn't know, several miles away, 4 or 5 miles away. And what I do every day is walk and talk to people. So I go, well, I'll just walk and find this house and bring them a disc. And I got there with the disc, and they just grabbed me and pulled me in the house and said, sit down. And I watched the whole, they had CNN basically.
Huh. So
they
they
just
had
plugged
a
it in, so-
dish or something?
Pardon me?
Did
No,
they-
no, the government
Oh, the
just
government.
plugged into CNN, and so I watched
Wow.
everything that you watched. A little bit later, because it was noon maybe by the time I started watching it, but I saw the
Wow.
whole thing. Then I didn't get home for 10 days. I couldn't get
Wow.
out, I didn't have any money. Sort of fun. One of the good stories though. But people on the street would hug me. They'd say, are you American? And they'd hug you, and they're remarkable. Really generous folks. And but I tell them, wait till they open up travel and all the crazy Americans come to want to buy everything you own. Because the Americans that go now are Americans that are interested in Cuba. They want to help them, they want to interact with them, it's cultural, it's educational. So they're seeing a really good cross-section, but I warn them, look out, things will change.
So I'm sure you get this question, what happens after, well, Fidel or his brother go?
I do get that question. Next question? I have no idea. I think that they would, my guess, and sort of my hope, is that they will remain a socialist democracy, where they will go into elections, but they will, as of now, they don't sell any soil to foreigners. So all the hotels, the big fancy hotels I mentioned earlier, were built by the Spanish and by the Italians, but they're 51% owned by the Cuban government. And as long as they do that, I think they're safe. Because if they start selling off land, Cubans have no money. So foreigners will come and buy all the oceanfront, all the prime brands, all the Cubans are going to get shoved into the hinterlands. So as long as they can keep that and come up with, I think this new capitalism is helping a lot of people like it. The internet, they just ran a fiber optics cable from Venezuela, so they're upgrading all the internet accessibility, all these new businesses. You're now able to, before you could not sell your home. You had a title to your home, you could live there till you died. You could trade titles with another person. I had a friend who lived with his mother and had a big house, and he wanted to get married, so they traded that title for 2 other titles, and they moved. So they could do that, but you could never change money. So as of a year ago, now you can legally buy and sell houses, so all of a sudden housing values have gone way up. You can buy and sell cars, which you could only sell the old 50s cars, you couldn't have a newer one. So all that's changed in the last year. So there's a lot of positive, low-level changes that are going to lead to something. But I sure can't. I'm not a fortune teller. I mean, I know what I wish for. I wish they can keep a lot of what they have. The healthcare and the education. Well, you mentioned literacy. It's 100% virtually. And their infant mortality rate's the same as ours. So, and their life expectancy is the same as ours. So, and they make $20 a month. So, their priorities are great, but unless you want to be a millionaire.
Well, I noticed it seems like time stopped in the 50s when Batista was overthrown.
It's a bit of a time warp.
Get the parts, how do they do things to keep this stuff going? 'Cause
They
we've had this big embargo.
make them. They make them. Yeah. I've taken carburetors down and stuff like that, but they make these cars, they keep these cars running. And I mean, I got to ride a really nice old 53 Buick from a town 50 miles away. And he says, it's a Hyundai. He put a whole Hyundai drivetrain, everything's Hyundai, and it's a perfect 53 Chevy. I mean, you never have any clue. He said, we just switch them out. Some have kerosene engines. They make parts. They're very inventive by necessity is another way.
I did want to ask, I asked earlier about paint. I know it sounds superficial, but in Latin America, most of Latin America is
Right.
bright colored, dramatic,
Right.
and painted. And Cuba looks depressing. There's very little paint on it.
It's not
Is that a
depressing to
lack
me.
of access?
It's not depressing to me, but I don't have any.
I'm just saying, looking at the
My
picture.
last couple trips there, I have noticed entire blocks being painted fabulous colors. So I
That's
don't know.
Latin America.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is paint is being discovered, and because I think it's partially because of this ability to buy and sell houses, that now the value has come up enough that they can afford to fix up houses.
Issue of affording.
It was money. Nobody's gonna buy a gallon of paint for $50 when you make $20 a month.
$50.
Well, it's probably 50 there by the time you ship it down there because of the embargo. We talk about the embargo, which would make me angry, but, so, yeah, no, all our policies, the 3 policies are the trade embargo, the travel embargo, and the wet foot, dry foot policy, which means any Cuban that touches U.S. soil can stay here. And that's an absolutely criminal policy. It was ostensibly put in place because these poor Cubans were escaping political persecution in Cuba, and we would bring them here. But all the ones that came here were looking for money. They didn't care about the government. They had nothing to do with the government. They just wanted to come here. And you put one Cuban on a raft, and it makes the headlines. 2,000 Mexicans were crossing the border a day at the same time into the desert and dying. Not a peep. One Cuban on a raft, and you get front page of the
Money
New York
in
Times.
Miami.
Yeah, Miami.
And the people that left were
So
the people that were capable of making money
Yeah.
during the time of Batista when
Yeah.
he was over.
Well, and it's a huge industry in Miami now, the embargo. There's a whole levels to that we won't go into tonight. You haven't said anything yet. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, what was your overall assessment of this, the infrastructure, electricity, gas, water, telephone service?
It's not going to be able to handle a quick changeover. It seems to me that it works. Someone asked me about the sewer system, and I go, well, I said, there's no evidence of a bad sewer system. It doesn't smell bad. So things work, but the blackouts that they had so many of a while back are pretty much a thing of the past. And part of it was a huge turbine that they had to send back to France to have rebuilt and bring back on a barge, which covered, I don't know what percentage, a huge percentage of the island. So they've done that. So, you know, electricity is pretty steady. The roads are okay, but they can't take, you know, they're not ready for industry. Industry's not gonna pop up overnight. If they move to that, it's gonna take 10 years for it to be, they just have to do it piece by piece, because everything's old.
So is everybody carrying cell phones now? What do they
Yeah,
do?
oh yeah, cell phones are everywhere. That's pretty new, last couple of years. So almost everybody I see has a cell phone. Sort of sad, and I liked it when everyone just talked.
Well, if they
We
give
used to
out-
do that here.
Are they giving out cell phones like they did in
No, no.
Venezuela?
No, they're buying them. And everyone has a TV set, they make $20 a month, and they got a $400 TV set. So what that tells you is there's all these layers to the economy that are aside from the official layer.
I just had a question, that you had a picture of the one guy who was using film to produce a picture. Do they have, the photographers down there, do they use traditional or are they digital or?
Well, most of the ones I know are digital now, yeah, pretty much. And even, I gave one of the cameras from my book, I gave to my friend's daughter, and she used it for about a year, and she said, oh, I need a digital one now, you know, so, I mean, it's the digital era, and like I say, cell phones and digital cameras. Of course, cell phones are cameras now, so
Yeah.
that's the new age as well. So, does anyone want to talk about anything other than Cuba? You know, I don't know, I came prepared to sort of yak about anything. You're more than welcome to look at some of these prints and see some of that. Like I said, in the easels, there's some, all the things in the easels have front and back. I just grabbed a handful.
And Jack, am I correct in that you're selling some of this stuff, or is it mainly your book?
I sell the book for $50. It's $65 on Amazon. I sell them for $50, so it's a huge savings. And I would sell any prints. I hadn't really thought about selling prints, but I just wanted to show some of the work. But I guess I want to talk a little bit about the switch to digital. In 2005, the book came out, and that was pretty much the end of my film. And I still was printing in the darkroom. And then I bought an Epson 4800, and that was the first printer that I felt that I could come out of the darkroom and still get prints that I was happy with. So that got me out of the darkroom. And it was nice because if someone ordered some of these prints, like that building print, there's a lot of dodging and burning and work in that. It might take me 2 hours to get the print that I want. And once I had prepared the files for the book, I could literally push the button and give people a print. So I'm pretty happy with that phase of digital, and I keep coming up with new ways to print, and you'll see some of the borders I'm using, like I guess on that far portrait with the black borders that mimics the work I did in the darkroom. That's sort of that's from Alien Skin, you know, they come up with all these different ways to do things. And I'm trying to keep the same character that I always loved in